Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Regional Services Committee meeting for September 24th. I'd like to, first of all, welcome Alternate Director Sebring to the table and also acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Coast Salish people. And I need an approval of the agenda, please. Moved and seconded, all in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion's carried. An adoption of the minutes from the August 22nd meeting. Moved? Second? Any question? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Moving now to any business arising from the minutes.
No, Madam Chair, but I would just like to point out, because this video will be archived, on the agenda cover sheet it says September the 24th, and that's how this, it's actually, today is September the 26th, so if anybody's watching this on video, just wanted to let them know they're watching the right meeting.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, the public input period. Is there anyone that wishes to provide some public input? It's an opportunity to comment on the agenda item before us, and the public process period to proceed is in timely fashion.
Good morning, Madam Chair and
Good morning.
Directors.
And your name?
I don't believe I have to state my name.
Oh, you don't have to? Okay, sorry.
That's okay,
Just
thank
automatic.
you. I think people know me. I have a question or want to make a comment on the airport feasibility study report that you will be hearing today. I understand, and I was present when the proposal was put forward at the August 22nd EAS, or at the Regional Services Committee meeting. And I see a number of referrals that have gone out to business leaders and government and transit, etc. But what I don't see here is referrals to in-house engineering or environmental services. But more importantly, I don't see where this has been put out to the public so that they can be informed prior to this committee and the economic development people spending taxpayers' dollars. I think there's, it would be a good idea for the local government here and the proponent to meet with the public and let them know what's being proposed in their neighborhood. I'm not saying I'm opposed or I'm informed, I'm just saying where is the due diligence of the directors and the CVRD staff to work with the public ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Seeing no one else, we'll move on to delegations.
No delegations,
Correspondence.
no correspondence,
Information.
no information items today.
Moving on now to reports.
First report from the Parks and Trails Planner regarding the Cowichan Valley Trail route through the Cowichan Exhibition Grounds, and there is a recommendation that it be recommended to the board that an application to the Agricultural Land Commission be submitted for approval to construct and maintain the Cowichan Valley Trail within the Agricultural Land Reserve across the Cowichan Exhibition Society's property at 7380 Trans-Canada Highway. And 2, a statutory right-of-way agreement in favor of the Cowichan Valley Regional District be approved for registration on the Cowichan Exhibition Grounds property with a legal description for the Cowichan Valley Trail, inclusive of the terms and conditions outlined in the Parks and Trails Division staff report dated August 22nd, 2018.
Thank you. There was a mover and you're seconding it. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Moving on now to R2.
R2 from the Manager of the Economic Development Division, Cowichan Airport Feasibility Study, and there is a recommendation that it be recommended to the board that an airport feasibility study be undertaken for the Cowichan region.
It's been moved. It's been seconded. Is there any discussion on the airport feasibility study? Director Nicholson.
I think I'm very supportive of doing a feasibility study. I think, though, that it is a really important land use decision ultimately that will potentially have a large impact on the neighboring community wherever it's chosen to go. So I am really interested in having some input or some seeing ahead of time what the criteria will be for the study. And I think we need to think this one through carefully because it potentially has large implications for different areas.
All right, just Director Acton? Oh, Director Stone? Do you
So-
want to, would you like Amy Melmock, would you like a response to that if there's
Oh.
going to?
Well, I was going to ask a question that went
Okay.
off of
Okay, go
Director
ahead.
Nicholson's
Director
comment,
Stone.
and I think they're along the same lines.
Okay.
Through to staff, I was wondering if during the feasibility study that potential sites would be part of that, and then we can engage in the consultation process with people in the areas affected by those sites, because I think that's the most critical piece. It's great to say, oh, it's feasible in the region, but without identifying potential sites and then engaging with those areas, it would be kind of maybe putting the cart before the horse. But I think from my perception, the feasibility study comes first. Once some sites are identified, then we would engage with potential residents in those areas.
Ms. Melmock? Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, and thank you. The intention with the feasibility study is that a community engagement process be built into the activity, so that if we're looking at potential sites, there's a robust discussion as to whether these sites initially pass muster in terms of community support or concern about the potential site. So that would be a part of the feasibility study itself.
Okay. Director Dory?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Melmotte, when we did the hospital siting and that sort of thing, we came up with like 25 different parameters which you must consider in a hospital site. In this study, will they be forming those parameters of a successful airport and ways that they can mitigate noise and traffic and all this sort of thing? I mean, I know you're very early in the process, but at some point we're going to have a formulation of these criteria for a good local airport. So where's the criteria at this point in time?
The criteria that we will be looking at will be developed as a function of the RFP process, and so I've spelled out in the report the central criteria that we want to take into consideration, which first of all, the suitability of any given site vis-a-vis its potential as an actual airstrip for its aeronautic considerations, then the consideration of the impact on neighboring properties, etc. And that should have a fulsome description of whether there would be noise impact, access impact, etc. And then the other consideration would be just access in terms of if it's a good location vis-a-vis access to the site for a variety of uses and distance locations, etc. So it will be a very detailed series of criteria that we'll have to develop. And this fundamentally is why we're asking for an opportunity to develop the RFP so that we can begin that process of looking at that detailed criteria.
Follow-up, Director Dory?
Yes, in my area, we had 3 issues with the airport in Nanaimo, and one of them was the air cadets would have glider practice, and they were gliding over communities and making a noise, circling and then going into the airport. The other issue was the float planes were practicing their landings and takeoffs in front of Saltaire at 8:30 in the Sunday morning, because it was convenient for them. And so, but that has since ceased. And the other issue was that the people taking lessons were practicing their stall and recovery methods over Porter's Field, the farm, which is a pretty safe place to do it, but it was still making these funny sounds on the weekends usually, and that was an issue. So all of those things will come up probably in your discussions with the community. So I know that economically having an airport is very, very beneficial for the community. It brings in lots of extra money, and it provides recreation for all kinds of aeronautics activities. So I'm not opposed to it. I just wanted to make sure that we covered some of those things. Thank you.
I'm sure they will be looked into. Director Acton, Sebring, and Nicholson. Does anyone else?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious if this is already part of your business plan for this year, because I'm wondering, how is this going to affect other items that are on your to-do lists or strategic things that you're trying to accomplish? And I know it's coming, I think it mentioned some reserve funds, but what else? What other items should we be looking at this in a greater picture when this money could be going to something else?
That's a very good question, actually. Thank you. I have been considering this within the structure of my work plan for some time, because it is a major undertaking, and it's why when the request came forward through various sources to work on the RFP for this, that I actually thought of it within the context of my 2019 work plan. And I actually think there's some alignment with other activities that we'll be following up with in 2019 as well. The industrial land use strategy that we'll be doing, there's some alignment there with it. And I think, too, just the ongoing development of some of the sector activity that we have, whether it be in tourism or whether it be in other areas, there is alignment with this notion as well of looking at, what role air transportation plays in our region. And so, yes, it is a big commitment for 2019, but I think it's in alignment with my other activities.
Follow up, Director Acton?
Thank you. So Amy, so that said, I think this is a decision that should be presented to the new board with your full scope of plan of economic Cowichan, what you've done, where you're going, and what you plan to do, and then your request of funding with that too. So I don't know if anyone else is, that would be my suggestion.
Director Sebring.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions, if I might. First of all, just something that Ms. Melmock said. You used the term RFP. Are we doing this in-house, or are we issuing an RFP to have somebody on the outside do it? I'm just trying to get some clarity.
We would be issuing an RFP, yes.
So somebody else on the outside?
Well, we in any RFP, we're heavily involved in the process, but we would want to have someone who's a specialist in this area looking at the considerations. Yes.
Mr. Blackwell?
Thank you. Just thought I'd contribute for your consideration that any facility that is designated as an aerodrome is under federal jurisdiction, and local zoning or bylaws and so forth won't apply. So there is a clear line over which the CVRD has no involvement over the location of an aerodrome.
Thank you.
If I may, the second question, which was actually my first until Amy mentioned the RFP, and I guess this is to either our Director of Corporate Services or the CAO. I look at the budget implications here, and it's a $30,000 touch. And as I read the report, EDC has recommended $25,000 from its current operating reserve be dedicated to this project within the 2019 budget. that's not the 2018 budget. Is this still subject to budget approval, I guess is where I'm going. I mean, you know, somebody else mentioned maybe we should leave this for the new board to determine. Maybe that's not a bad idea. If we pass this motion today, is it automatic that it's budget pre-approval for 2019? I'm not that familiar with process around here.
Mr. Kieber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So no board can commit a future board to any expenditure. So this would be part of the budget recommendations. It would give the staff direction to include it in the 2019 budget, but it's still up for the board to actually approve that at that time.
So this is more, this recommendation then is more an approval in principle than an actual designation of dollars. Maybe it should have been written that way. Thank you.
Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we could split this into a two-part exercise and have the criteria and the process develop first and then bring it back. I remain really concerned about how we manage this, because I have seen too many projects. They get, you know, you might end up with just one site that is basically feasible to fly planes in and out of, and yet it may not be acceptable to the neighborhood. And I think we need to think through how we would manage that in advance. And I don't want to get down the road before we have that thought through. And so it seems to me that we should take this slowly and in steps. And maybe that would also help on the issue of leaving it for the next board. Maybe we could get started on the smaller scope, you know, the development of what we would be, the criteria would be, and the process for consultation, and then take it to the next one. And actually, I would move that if that's appropriate.
The motion has already been moved and seconded. That's on the floor.
Maybe it could be revised, could it?
Mr. Crothers.
Maybe I'll offer a suggestion. I think what Director Nicholson's referring to is in the analysis, section 1, the financial, operational, and governance considerations for creating an economically viable, sustainable facility. That would address some of the issues, as Mr. Blackwell suggested, around the federal authority for aerodromes. That may be a first step in this before you start establishing potential sites. I agree with Director Nicholson. As your administrator, I can just see, you know, the issues associated with going out and essentially defending a site after a site's been identified, versus having this board, the subsequent board, be able to review and consider the overall viability. Is it something you even want to consider as a board to take it to that next step? So I think that might be an astute approach to take, to look at the governance issues, the viability, the economics of an airport without identifying where that might be in specific terms, and then being able to then have the board make a decision to say, yes, this looks like it has some merit, and then move forward with a strategy around how to potentially identify a specific site.
Microphone, sorry. Just that the recommendation is before us that the board, that an airport feasibility study be undertaken for the Cowichan region.
That-
So,
Can I just interject
Sure.
briefly? The intention of this activity was really to look at the criteria for potential sites, not to select one, first and foremost. And so we're really, we're looking at the process, I should say, the criteria. And, you know, if there's an amendment that is being contemplated that allows us to move forward on, you know, looking at detailed criteria and process, I think that would keep the activity in play and would allow us to move forward in a reasonable fashion until this comes up for budget consideration as a full scenario around an RFP. again, I want to emphasize that this is not an RFP that is suggesting any particular site. It's looking at the criteria, it's looking at the fulsome scenario around the criteria, and then allowing us to move forward with balanced information.
Director Marsh?
I'm not sure. I'd be happy to second the motion. I don't feel awake enough
It's
to
been
to
moved
make
and seconded?
the amendment.
No, I haven't heard an amendment.
So if someone would help, could we defer over to Director Lefebvre, because I think he's got the wording, and I'd be happy to second it and speak to it.
Director
Madam Chair?
Lefebvre, you have an amendment?
Yeah, I'd like to propose an amendment based on Mr. Crothers' advice. Purpose of this report, that the first step of the airport feasibility study be undertaken, which includes the financial, operational, and governance considerations for creating an economically viable and sustainable facility. So instead of the entire amount of work, it just refers to that first section of work.
Okay, is there a seconder for the amendment? Well, it's been moved and seconded. And on
may I
the
speak?
on the amendment, we're speaking on the amendment
So
now.
I could support the amendment if it also gave the latitude to Ms. Melmock to do what she was suggesting she needed to do. And I'm not sure if it does. Do you feel that it does?
So are you, oh,
Let me take a stab at it. I believe it does. If
Okay.
you're talking about an economically viable, sustainable airport facility, you're going to be looking at criteria
Okay.
around what that's going to
Very
do.
good.
So what we're going to do is, I mean, essentially what's been proposed here, without identifying specific sites, we will come back to this board with a feasibility study that talks about what are the components that are needed to operate an economically viable airport in the region, and all of that background information. As Ms. Melmock says, without identifying a particular site, the criteria, the various aspects that would contribute to a viable airport, that will come back to this board to determine whether they want to move forward and start to investigate. It'll identify whether or not a second airport is even viable economically. That's ultimately what you're trying to achieve through this exercise.
Thank you. So I'm happy to.
you are seconding the motion?
I did already second it, and
Okay.
I'm happy to support it, but I do have something else I'd like to
Okay,
add.
I have
if
Mr.
may.
Blackwell, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just a little add-on to what Mr. Carruthers was saying. This is the initiative of the Duncan Flying Club, not the CVRD. The CVRD has been asked to help them determine whether or not we'll call it an expanded airport function, is viable here or not. And if they have that information in hand, the expectation, at least I would have, is that they would then move themselves to the next step, which is to source a location for a potential future facility. I can't imagine that they would ask the CVRD to be a partner or to help manage or co-own such an airport. That's certainly nothing that I've heard. They are just looking for support to undertake an analysis to determine whether or not a facility is viable, as I've said. And if so, it's up to them to go and do the heavy lifting around finding a suitable location and so forth. They've not approached myself or Ms. Melmock with regard to any co-ownership or any relationship around its functioning. That would be their responsibility solely. And by the way, as I mentioned, if they do identify a piece of land, they can go ahead and designate it as an aerodrome, and our zoning bylaws have no effect. They can do that entirely without us.
Director Marsh?
Thank you, and perhaps that is the answer to my next question, because I think that the CVRD is a signatory to the Climate Action Charter, am I correct? So an airport is going to affect emissions in the region, but is Mr. Blackwell, are we to believe from his report that we have nothing to say about it if the federal government wants us to have those additional emissions? Well, not wants us to, but is going to allow them.
Mr. Blackwell?
Thank you. It's not an easy one to answer.
Okay, I can withdraw that question, and just say, it's my hope that we, as a signatory to the Climate Action Charter, would have some kind of an idea as we report out to the community, how this will affect our goal to reduce emissions and to get to zero by, I don't know when it is, or get to 80% under by 2050, I think it is. I don't know how to track all that stuff. I'm sure there is modeling that does that. And so my preference would be that we could sort of work as a region, like the Vancouver Island region, and look at that too. And I don't know how to measure that, but if that's a possibility down the road, I'd sure be into hearing about that.
I have Director Morrison, Acton, Kuhn, and Day. Director Morrison. And
Thank you,
Nicholson.
Madam Chair. As I sit here and listen to the comments, I'm getting more and more concerned about the direction that we're going here. We were approached by a group that wants to do a feasibility study. Nowhere in this did I see us engaging to the extent that the discussion around this table would almost indicate a level of ownership and participation and yes, these are important points that have been made, but this is about doing a feasibility on whether or not it should be done. It's not about site selection. I go back to the hospital site selection process. There was a whole bunch of work that was done in advance of you know, a site eventually being chosen. And just by the comments and the interest in the detail around here, I'm really questioning why we're diving in as deep as we are when this really is, we're assisting through a process from the Flying Club to determine, you know, if not the site and all of that. So I just, you know, ask everyone to think about how involved we want to be. I don't think we're talking about a municipal airport authority and us being involved to that extent. So, you know, let's do the feasibility study and let's not necessarily have our fingerprints all over it.
Thank you, Director Morrison. I move to Director Acton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm getting a little confused here. So if we're approached by a group who, it's in their interest that they're into flying and everything, and then now they have not come to us with very much money towards it. And does this become a grant and aid? Like, we're just helping them do an RFP. And we're not looking, I'm really upset that we're not looking at the whole picture of, I can't remember, how much is Economic Cowichan's budget even? Is this 10% of the budget? Is this, I'm feeling like we're not looking at the whole picture, and we
Crothers.
should.
Yeah, if I can, I tie the two concerns or the 2 points that were just raised by Director Morrison and Director Acton. I think that's where the confusion is coming. You were approached by a community group who wanted some support in doing a feasibility study. You have two options. You can do a grant and aid, and you can provide the funding to the Duncan Flying Club, and they can do a feasibility study and report back to you. We're taking this on. The recommendation here is that the CVRD lead this feasibility study. And so there will be some expectations around that. As you see in the recommendations, one of the aspects of it is governance. What does the governance look like? I would suggest that there could be some unspoken, you know, potential expectations that maybe there would be an airport service on the part of the CVRD, if that's what the feasibility study suggested, that in order to run effective, cost-effective, well-run airport, that maybe there needs to be. And it's not unheard of that regional districts have airport services. They do. Many of them do. But I think you as a committee need to be clear on the direction that you're giving. Director Acton makes a good point. If it was simply supporting the Duncan Flying Club in their efforts, you could give them a grant and aid. They could undertake a feasibility study and report back to you. I get the sense that there's a desire to do something more than that, and that the CVRD is somewhat taking the lead on making sure that this feasibility study considers kind of the regional aspect. So that's really something you as a committee have to grapple with in terms of direction for us as staff.
Director Kuhn.
Yeah, I have the impression we're trying to cover too many bases with this simple motion here. I would like to get back to the original motion rather than even considering the change to it. But if we are concerned about the cost, and we've been approached by several companies that that might be a good idea to have that airport, well, why don't we approach them and ask them to contribute some money toward that feasibility study? I can't see any reason why they shouldn't. I mean, if for large corporations like Timber West or even Promac, I mean, to give us a couple of $1,000s to add them, I think there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. So, but let's not try to cover all the bases with this simple motion just to do a feasibility study. I mean, now we're getting carried away in all kinds of different directions, and I think that's a mistake. Thank you.
Director Day. Okay, we're moving to Director Nicholson on the amendment.
Could you please read the amendment so I can make sure I'm speaking to it?
Yeah.
Just to refresh everybody where we are, so the motion, the original motion that was on the floor was that it be recommended to the board that an airport feasibility study be undertaken for the Cowichan region. The motion that's on the floor right now is that that motion I just read be amended by adding that would examine the financial, operational, and governance considerations for creating an economically viable, sustainable facility.
All right, so I need some clarification. I am of the opinion that we should do this in a phased way, and that I agree with what is in the amended version, but I would also like to add the identification of siting criteria. So I think that there's a lot of issues around land use and the social impacts and the environmental impacts around where you would choose a site. So in the original proposal, when I look at the analysis, it talks about the intended feasibility study would examine the potential locations in the region. That took me to understand that we would actually be identifying sites in the region where it would be possible. I do not think we should do this until we have a fuller understanding of whether we would want to move ahead with an airport and how we would manage the social impacts. So that was my original concern, and I would be happy to support the amendment if we could amend the amendment to include the siting criteria. And I hope I'm clear.
Apparently not.
No, Madam Chair, it's not possible to amend an amendment. We have to vote on the amendment, and if it goes through, you can then amend the main motion later with further amendments, but you can't keep amending motions.
Can we withdraw the amendment?
Director Lefebvre.
Thank you. Just to address Director Nicholson's concern, the amendment refers to operational considerations, and I would think that completely covers her concerns around siting.
I don't think it does necessarily.
Well, to me, that's what that language says. So,
Well, maybe the staff could clarify.
I think some consideration will have to be given to siting criteria within the operational context, because otherwise, how would you bring a fulsome discussion around the siting or around the operational criteria? It can't be completely arbitrary. I think you have to consider some of the siting.
Director Dory.
Thank you. I think the site is very important. I think that if you
On the
buy a
amendment.
house, what's that?
On the amendment.
Yeah. If you buy a house near an airport, you can expect that there's going to be noise and you have no complaints about the noise. If you buy a house that's not near an airport and an airport moves in, that's an issue. So at the Butler Brothers site, are they expecting to mine the gravel underneath the airport? Is that why we're here today?
Excuse me, Director Dory, this is off the subject. We are voting on the amendment. So this is, the discussion right now
Okay.
is on the amendment, not going back into all the details of this. It is strictly on the amendment, and I'm going to call the question. Director Nicholson.
I have one more question. Can we assume if we're doing a lesser, that this will cost less?
I think to do a fulsome job on this, you need the budget that has been recommended.
Once again, does anybody need to hear the amendment? Yes, please. Okay, could,
That the motion be amended by adding that would examine the financial, operational, and governance considerations for creating an economically viable, sustainable facility.
on the amendment, all in favor? Opposed? Motion has carried. Now on the, okay, so there was 5 that were opposed? Okay. On the amendment, let's do this again. All in favor of the amendment? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All opposed to the amendment? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Motion is defeated.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you.
actually,
Whoops.
we have 13 members here, so it would be 7-6. The motion carries.
Oh, thank you. Okay, that's what I was right the first, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So with the amendment, the original motion with the amendment. Do we need that read out? Okay, gotta call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Moving on now to R3.
R3, it's a verbal report from the Manager of Economic Development Division with Urban Systems as well regarding the industrial land use strategy.
Well, thank you very much. And this is very apropos of the discussion we just had, so thank you. We're talking about competition for land use, really. And I'm here today by myself. You can expect that Urban Systems will be joining us when we do the final report for the industrial land use strategy. But this is just an update on it. We're currently looking at the second draft of the report and hoping to bring forward the third and final draft in December. But before I carry on, I want to say something to this particular gathering of people around the table. I want to thank you for your support of my office during the last 2 years, and I want to acknowledge each and every one of you for the contribution you have made to economic development and to working with me. And I really sincerely thank all of you. And for those of you that are acclaimed, congratulations. For those of you that are not reoffering, I wish you all the best, and I hope that you stay in touch with our office. And for those of you that are in the race, run a good race and best of luck. So just wanted to acknowledge that before we move forward with this presentation and offer this brief update for you. So is it coming up on the screen? Should be. Oh, just the back of my head. Is there something we should be doing here? Okay.
Being patient.
All right. Patience isn't one of my virtues, sadly. Yeah, there you go. Beth, are we on our way? Okay.
There we go.
All right, so very a brief scroll through this activity here. So what I'm going to give you is just an overview of the strategy today, next steps that we're undertaking. So the process for the industrial land use strategy really began in the spring of 2018 when Urban Systems was hired as the project consultant. And we actually put together an industry advisory panel as well. And that's been a really valuable process. It's allowed us to talk to industry people from across the region and hear their perspectives on industrial land use. In amongst that mix, we've had some commercial realtors, and we've had different people in the land who are always, dealing with this fundamental question. And as a consequence, as a positive consequence, I would say, of forming the industrial panel, I'm getting a lot more calls from people about, direct calls about people about questions about where industrial land might be available and what partnerships might be available. So it's been great. And we've really made an effort to have our First Nations partners at the table as well for this particular process. So it's been great. As part of the process, Janae Enns and I went out and actually hoofed it out to every last industrial site in the region, and sometimes we were accompanied by our board members around the table and by chamber members, and that was a really valuable process as well. We heard a lot of anecdotal comments, and we actually got responses from more than 50 survey respondents across the region at our current industrial parks as to how they feel about our current industrial lands. And our consultants conducted one-on-one interviews with over 20 stakeholders, so it's been a very robust process. And then as part of the strategy as well, they've been looking at our GIS mapping and doing their project research, considering the past studies that have been done and the current activities that are underway vis-a-vis land use in the region. So the strategy goals include addressing the needs of existing industries, looking at the current trends in industrial development in Cowichan, looking at the gaps and opportunities and solutions for addressing the gaps in our region, and acting on opportunities to attract new investment. And the strategy actions for the consultants have been a review of the labor force trends in Cowichan, looking at industrial land demand projections, and that's based on employment activity in our region, and looking ahead, looking at the inventory of land that we have and reviewing it, looking at the sector development trends, and creating a series of recommendations. So looking at the labor force trends, what the consultants have been doing is looking at population projections over time. That's part of what the Cowichan 2050 process has been doing as well, and part of what the OCP process is involving. And we're looking at Cowichan's labor force and where it's concentrated, and how this is going to play into the industries that will have the greatest strength in the region. Sorry. Why is this not moving forward? Oh, sorry. So some of the highlights of that that examination brought forward the fact that we actually have a very we have a trend where our population is aging, actually, and this is this is due to the higher number, I would say, of retirement age people that are in the community, but also people that are moving into the community. But we are showing modest growth in that 25 to 44-year-old age cohort. And we actually experienced notable employment growth in areas like construction and manufacturing and mining and quarrying. So industrial land demand, one of the things that we noted is that when we contrasted the projections on population growth and employment in industrial sectors in the Cowichan, and the highlighted information is that over the next 8 to 10 years, it's anticipated that we're going to need at least 95 to 120 acres of new industrial land development to support the employment projections in the region. In terms of our industrial land inventory, what was undertaken here is we looked at the overall land base in Cowichan. We're studying the availability of land by region and looking at the industrial classifications to see how much land is being used according to sector in Cowichan. So no surprises here in terms of those inventory highlights. 75% of our land base, as you all know, is forestry. And what's interesting is that within that construct of our land base, less than a half a percentage is actually zoned for industrial land right now. The largest percentage, again, no surprise, of industrial land is in North Cowichan, and the smallest percentage is in Lake Cowichan. And when you take into considerations things like where some of our industrial lands are and what the slope considerations are on that land, what the riparian buffers are, and the zoning and location of these lands, these all negatively impact what we consider to be vacant land in our region. So of that, roughly 1,400 hectares of industrial land that we have, it actually gets down to less than 400 hectares of what we consider to be vacant land when you take all of those things into consideration. So then we've been looking at sector trends on Vancouver Island. One of the things that we know is that there's an increasing demand for port facilities on Vancouver Island. And there's decreasing industrial land availability in both the Capital Regional District and the Regional District of Nanaimo. And within Cowichan, there's a lack of appropriately zoned and serviced lands in the half-acre to 5-acre lot criteria. And Cowichan is really a compelling location for lower mainland clients, no surprise. Again, thanks to the more competitive land and housing costs in our region relative to lower mainland. So when we look at those sector trends, we see immediate opportunities in things that are already strong on the ground here: construction and design, manufacturing, specialty food processing, and medical cannabis. And there's long-term and medium-term opportunities in areas like tech. There's a big clean tech initiative going on with the province right now, which we should be looking into. There's med tech that may be associated with the new hospital. There's transportation and warehousing, marine services, and aquaculture. So I'll be doing a study on all of those. Just kidding.
Sure, I'll have it by tomorrow.
And I'll have them done by tomorrow, in addition to the airport study. So why is this study important? I just wanted to actually really drive this point home. What's important about this study is that when we look at our land base, we really need to highlight the need to protect and increase the availability of lands that are directly related to key employment needs and opportunities. So one of the conversations I have a lot in the region is how do we grow the availability of high-paying, high-skilled jobs? And it's in this industrial sector that we have to be considerate of that. So we have to pay attention to where our industrial lands are located and if we're protecting them and if we're enhancing them. The other important thing about this study is it really has started this process of creating new partnerships to look at these questions, to deal with these challenges and opportunities. And it really has pointed the way to where we can be focused on new sector development and business attraction strategies. So I have a long list of activities for follow-up in the new year related to this study. And when we bring forward our recommendations to the CVRD, they're going to be aimed at local government, they're going to be aimed at our project partners and stakeholders, and they will also be aimed at economic development Cowichan itself. So our next steps, we're actually reviewing some of the preliminary recommendations with our industry advisory panel today, and we'll be looking internally at some of the recommendations as well with our regional planners and stakeholders. And then we will bring a completed final draft and present it forward to the board in December. So thank you. Questions, comments?
Thank you. This is for information. I have Director Marsh. Kuhn.
Sorry, did you say Kuhn? Oh, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you to Ms. Melmock. I'm just so excited, and I love how you were able to spell out how what you're doing, which is so critical and so important. And I remember when you first came, you were talking about the land inventory. And to see all this come to fruition and to see how it dovetails with the OCPs that our EAC directors are going to be harmonizing, and, you know, to create as a region a place where there's livable jobs, because I suspect there isn't a lot of industrial land in Duncan, for instance, but those residents and their kids will need places to work.
That's right.
And so I actually feel really rejuvenated by this. And I came in feeling kind of tired and bummed on the trail, you know? So I really, really want to thank you,
That's great.
Ms. Melmock, for what you've done for, I think, all of the sectors of employment and the hope that you've given. And I think you've had something to do with the increasing robustness of business here in Cowichan.
Thank you.
So, thanks so much.
Director Kuhn. Oh, I have one more thing. Okay, follow-up, Director Marsh?
Absolutely. I've given it to Legislative Services, and they'll circulate it out. Thank you.
You were talking earlier about partnerships. What kind of partnerships were you talking about?
I think there's a wealth of partnerships that could be developed. You know, with the private sector, could be a partnership that involves us. Could be a partnership that involves the First Nations. So we're still trying to, you know, look at the full robust picture where those partnerships could emerge. But I think, and some of those partnerships are actually already in play. I'm looking over at Mayor Stone here, and certainly there's a robust partnership with the town and Stamanis First Nation on that could have implications for industrial land there. So I think there's a variety of partnerships, and hopefully we can spell those out as we bring the recommendations forward.
Director Morrison and then Stone.
Thank you. Through you to Ms. Melmock. I've been following along with the work that you've been doing, and I haven't raised this question yet, but I'm concerned about the interaction. You know, we're going to get a report. It's going to give us recommendations and the like, and I've been here long enough to remember us, this organization, converting what I thought were strategically placed historic industrial lands back to residential use, because people thought, you know, gosh, I don't want to be living next to that industrial plant. Oh, that might happen to have great jobs for my kids and my grandkids, but so we're now looking at a need for greater industrial land base for these good paying jobs to occur. But my question goes to, we have challenges in siting airports. We have challenges in siting, we had challenges in siting hospitals and transit facilities. How are we going to move forward with the, you know, a plan around industrial activity and yet be able to engage our communities and determine what that level of acceptable activity is before it's impacting on residential neighborhoods?
That's a great question, and I think there's two parts. There's two parts to my answer. One, I think, is changing the perception of what industrial land is. First of all, because the world of industry encompasses some activities that are not. It's evolved to a place where when we're talking about advanced manufacturing, or we're talking about, you know, med tech, or these kinds of industries, this is not stack activity. It's not the kind of activity that, you know, creates massive pollutants or creates unsavory activity. It's something that is really evolving into a very high tech scenario for our communities. So I think there is a changing evolution of what's going on in industry, and we have to raise awareness of that within our communities. And then to your point, I think we have to be very circumspect about zoning still and where we do locate things. But within that mix, too, I think we have to look at highest and best use of industrial lands, because a lot of the lands that we have currently zoned too, we haven't been intentional in how we have proposed them, and that's part of the challenge. So I think if we're intentional in the future, it will bode well for us.
Director Nicholson.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there are industrial lands, and are you differentiating in the study about the different types? Because I know we have a real issue in the Coxsila business area, which is mainly zoned industrial, and it's really an inappropriate place for many of the industrial activities that go on there. And so, it would be nice over time to be able to shift those out. And so, but then, of course, you lose industrial land from that perspective. So,
Right.
I think it's a little bit more complicated.
Well, it's interesting because we've had these discussions about the function of this plan and how it feeds into other activities like the OCP, and then, more detailed study into Coxsila and whatnot. And I think this is a foundational piece into saying, first of all, we need to look at opportunity, and we need to look at gaps and start the process of addressing that. But I think when we look at Coxsila, there's a very complex scenario of challenges and opportunities there. And you're right, we've walked that park together, and we know that you've got commercial activities up against more robust manufacturing activities, and then there's even residential activity put into the mix there. So I think that the extent of what we'll be doing is saying these are challenges within our parks, and we have to look to, in the future, towards higher and best use. And then there'll be further heavy lifting to do it within land use services to figure out exactly going forward in the future what some of the opportunities may be to do that.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was very informative.
Thank you.
Moving on now to R4.
In R4, a report from Environmental Services regarding the South Sector Liquid Waste Management Plan Amendment, and it's for information.
Ms. Miller, would you be speaking to this at all, or just here for questions?
I have a brief presentation. It's a technical matter, which I'm going to try to make into a planning matter, so in some ways. So if I may, if I take you through the presentation.
Sure.
So if I may, let me start here. Perfect. Is that better? So just to give you an update on some of the work that we've been doing in the South Cowichan region with regards to the liquid waste management plan process. And one of the reasons we wanted to bring it to this committee was because it has regional significance in terms of a different way of undertaking this master planning process. It also characterizes in a kind of an example, if you will, the direction of the board in terms of their priorities to look at effective land use planning, development of cohesive infrastructure, all predicated under the desire to take a different approach under watershed-based management. And so when we look at liquid waste management, we typically simply look at the facility. And since the original work was done in the South Cowichan area, we've had phenomenal change in both the regulatory framework as well as what's happening on the land base. So I'm going to take you through very, very quickly, hopefully, in very high-level terms, the work that we're doing. And we're also privileged to have Dr. Hitami here today, who's got a lot of experience in master planning frameworks and is helping to champion this project in terms of how we address it. So why is a master plan needed? And we know that in order to do effective development, effective investment in our communities, we really need to know, similar to the previous presentation around industrial lands, we need to know what the future is for this particular area, as well as the state of the infrastructure and how it best provides those services. Since the original plan was developed in 1998, that plan called for a large centralized facility that would provide sewage delivery, sewage treatment for the entirety of the South End. That is predicated on some planning philosophies of the day that centralized infrastructure was the best approach. We recognize that at the time, there was also a lot of money flowing from the feds to local governments. That money did not materialize, and so we've been in a reactive state since then. We also recognize that the nature of our communities is very different than we had originally thought as well. We've got substantial changes to regulations, and when the plan was developed in '98, there was no provincial guidance on how to go about developing a plan, and so we're following the guidance that was provided as a document in 2011 under this particular framework. We're also looking at the direction of the board is to look at it from a watershed-based point of view. Liquid waste is really based on the assimilative capacity of the environment to deal with those wastes. So sewage is typically treated through dilution, whether it's in surface water or groundwater, and so the receiving environments are critical. And in the South End, we've got Shawnigan Lake as a receiving environment that also provides potable water to the communities. And at the bottom end, we've got Saanich Inlet, which is a high priority area of interest for the community surrounding that particular area. We also have changes in population. What we originally thought was going to look like growth in the south end of the region is really quite different. The master plan also gives us a regulatory framework in which to link growth to infrastructure development. It also gives us an opportunity as a regulatory framework to address some of the key issues that we're starting to see come into play. So it gives us some of the tools that we haven't necessarily used in the past. So the plan area, as you can see, is we have the electoral boundaries noted there in sort of a light gray, but the watershed boundaries where the vast majority of the population and certainly the sewage treatment utilities, whether that is a private treatment utility vis-a-vis septic field or a large treatment facility, either operated by the CVRD or other entities. We've got 3 electoral areas within the planned study area, 24 treatment systems, 14 of which are owned independently. There are a few other ones which don't actually meet the metric of what the province would like to see falling under the plan. So the plan is very different than its cousin in the central area, which is really one plan with various electoral areas, the municipality of North Cowichan, the city of Duncan, but for all intents and purposes, one treatment facility. The profile for the south is much more complex than that. So what does a master planning process look like? It usually follows, at least according to the provincial guidelines, and I will state those are guidelines. They're not a regulatory process that we must follow. However, they're guidelines that make sense, and we certainly want to follow them. But however, given our financial capacity at this time, there are some key components that we are not addressing. We're choosing to put those aside and address them at a later date. Primarily stormwater management, and that will fall under, right now, the role of MOTI, but depending on how the CVRD moves forward into the future, it could play a higher role within our organization, so we'll address it at that point in time. 3 stages. The first stage is really around the problem statement. What's the problem? What's the carrying capacity within the area? The development, and similar to the conversation that you had earlier today around the airport, do we look at a particular site first, or do we look at the evaluation criteria in which we would assess the site? And so in the stage 1, we develop an evaluation criteria upon which we're going to look and examine each of the options that would address the problems. We would also develop a long list of potential solutions and go to the public in terms of public consultation. Did we miss any potential solutions in that long list? list? And does the public understand and approve the evaluation criteria that we will use to test against that long list of solutions? In the stage 2, we would be drilling down and looking at that long list, and it could be, a very broad list of solutions, addressing it based on the evaluation criteria, developing much more detailed financial cost estimates, and looking at some of the policy considerations. And then obviously public consultation in that phase as well. Stage 3 is really the conclusion of the master plan, if you will, and it goes to the province for review and for the minister's sign-off, at which point it becomes a plan very, very similar to the solid waste management plan. It's a regulatory plan that gives assent to the local government to undertake the recommendations that have gone through the public assent process. So that's an important consideration. The reality is that the world does not work in nice, clean, straight lines. And we have an example here. We've got other examples in Cobble Hill and some of the work that we're doing in Shawnigan, where under the first phase, we've identified, and simply since 1998, 97, since the original plan was in development phases, identified the need for infrastructure upgrades within the urban containment boundaries. Here's a Mill Bay Capital Program process. It is not independent of, it supports, and it is in line with the work that we're doing under the master planning process. And so, for example, that program benefited substantially because through the phase 1 process, in terms of the development of partnerships with the independent owners and the community as a whole, it allowed that funding program to move fairly quickly in a very, very short timeline to look at potential solutions and strategic investment of the grant funds. So that's the ideal solution, but under an iterative process around adaptive management, we don't want to wait to the end to come up with recommendations and then act on. If the recommendations that make sense, we act on them in parallel. The other thing that's slightly different in this process is this governance structure, which really has the CVRD at the top and obviously our First Nations partners as governance entities at the top of it. However, it is largely technical, and there is a technical committee or a team made up of land use planning, finance, GIS, engineering, et cetera, internal to the organization that really oversight. So it's not a particular staff member running with it on their own. It's got a lot of feedback loops internally that help address some of the issues. We will also be, as we go into the next phase, the phase 2, or stage 1, I keep getting them mixed up. Phase 1, stage 2, not stage 2, phase 1, the public consultation piece, the testing, well, we will have public input into a technical advisory committee. There's some various feedback loops. On the other side, you'll also see the South Sector Liquid Waste Management Steering Committee. And so we've pulled that out as the directors that are directly impacted. We want to make sure that we have a direct relationship with them. They provide oversight. They also provide a direct relationship with regards to the necessary funding and program management. And so it's a way of keeping them in the loop without necessarily drowning them in the technical detail. So this is quite a bit of a different process than the Central Sector Liquid Waste Management Plan went through. So the area. In order to do this work, one of the first phases is to really understand how the community is changing. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of metrics. You've got some metrics here which are really around the population changes from 2011 to 2016, pretty substantial. In terms of growth within the area. However, we also had a quick look and pulled some metrics thanks to Mr. Lawrence, who I asked to go back to 96 and give me just a quick summary on growth and what's happened in that area. From 96 to 2016, electoral area A had 45% growth within their electoral area. Electoral area B, 29.8, 30% growth. C in 17, so a total growth over the area of 29, almost 30%. This is very high growth without a master plan that really drives development. And some of our questions are, where is that development happening? So that's the kind of the more nuanced step that we take, given that we don't have a formal growth management strategy. So the other piece of information in terms of the reference growth from 91 to 96, before we really started to see this large growth curve happen within the region, we also had a very rapid growth in the south end. So between 91 and 96, the growth in the south end was at 21%, and that's contrasted to some of the population projections for the central sector, where North Cowichan's growth in their area of impact was estimated to be at 1%. And so very different kind of dynamic going on, which I think drives the importance of the relationship of the internal technical committee around land use planning and infrastructure nexus. So the overall growth within the CVRD over that period of time, in contrast, was 4.2%. So you see this really different spatial distribution of growth. So when we look at the difference of growth by electoral area versus what's happening within the urban containment boundaries, where we really, within our official community plans, we're saying that's where we want to drive development. That's really not what we're seeing to all intents and purposes everywhere. It's really quite distinct, and there's reasons for that. There's policy issues. Are we, in fact, an agent in terms of development in the community? Are we passive resistance? And I think this really is an issue that we're going to see across the region, is our role in this. So within the urban containment boundaries, for Shawnigan, 46% of the Area B population is inside of the urban containment boundary versus 54%, so slightly greater growth outside than in, but roughly balanced. 61% for Mill Bay within the urban containment boundary, and within electoral area C, which has two urban containment boundaries, 60% within the Cobble Hill node, growth outside of that on the other side of the highway as well, and 21% within the Arbutus Ridge area. So these are important numbers for financial consideration in terms of investment and land use planning. So we asked the consultant, we had very limited dollars, which meant us really looking at how do we use those dollars most effectively. And the decision was to use, because we needed information with regards to the capacity of the watershed to assimilate. So the watershed atlas and the watershed characterization, we felt that we could do that internally with our own resources. But we really wanted to have a third party assist us with the population growth and the scenario development. And so we worked with the planning department to come up with a couple of key scenarios. Always there is the, business as usual growth, and so this is what it looks like over the lifespan of the plan period. Takes us out to 2050, 2060. If we use a current scenario, you've got roughly equal growth inside and outside of the urban containment boundaries, with slightly, just 53% within the boundary, so slightly more in than out, but this kind of sprawl effect happening across the area. Versus a scenario which really looked at, can we redirect growth back into the urban containment boundaries with a target that trying to achieve 75% of the growth into those areas by 21% gives us a much greater increase in growth within those areas that would help drive future development and infrastructure support. So those are really important. The other things that came out of it, and then similar to the first piece around, perfect world scenario, you'd have a plan and then you'd start implementing the plan, is that in this first phase, there are a number of recommendations that came out of it, which is to focus on the development at this point in terms of going forward, building a logical system, is looking at community-wide sewer systems for each of the urban containment boundaries. Of course, we're working on that in Shawnigan, Cobble Hill, and Mill Bay right now. Continue to partner with the province to clarify the role of CVRD versus the province in regards to nutrient management. And this is an issue that Director Yanni DiNardo is seeing, particularly in Area D, with nutrients negatively affecting the receiving environment as well. So how do we deal, whether it's fecal matter from a bovine versus a human? How do we merge the two together more effectively? And then looking at some recommendations with regards to adjustments in policy with regards to the existing moratorium on acquiring private sewer systems. And I understand that the utility group is working on that and may have brought forward a report already. So we're seeing early recommendations being acted on incrementally, which is important. So you don't end up with a master plan at the end of the day that has 400 recommendations and it's just overwhelming. Let's deal with it as we can. It also helps give us rationale as we put forward grant applications to funders to be able to point back. We've gone through this. There's a formal recommendation on place. Again, recommendations with regards to servicing bylaws, likely in key areas, not across the board, but obviously we need to look at how do we deal with septage within the system as well. Land use planning, and certainly we're looking at some of the work that the planning department is undertaking right now with regards to modernization of their OCPs, and we're hoping that some of this gets embedded into that in a positive way, and looking at non-point sources of pollution in the receiving environment. And lastly, one of the items in the original plan, and certainly part of the provincial recommendations, are to have regular monitoring of the receiving environments to ensure that your plan actually is protecting that area. And so we're undertaking at this point. We now have the water quality objectives established for Shawnigan, Mill Bay, and the marine receiving environment, and those will be used to inform the plan. Because that data was collected almost 6 years ago, we're part of a regular cycle, and so we're in the process right now this summer of updating the attainment. And so you've got objectives, and then you go in on a regular basis to ensure that you are staying within the objectives parameters, and if you're not, then you can start to take remedial action. So that's my presentation. It's just a brief update. I know it wasn't brief, but it's summary update.
Thank you, Kate. I have 3 speakers, Director Marsh, Sebring, Kuhn, and Acton. Director Marsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Miller.
Now it's 4.
You were talking about MOTI and stormwater management, and I think I might be about to learn something, because in the municipality, I thought that we were required by the province to have our stormwater, like if there's a new development, nothing more that's leaving the property before it's developed is allowed to be leaving the property after. Maybe that's just our own local thing. I would have thought by now the province would be saying that we all had to do that. Can you tell just a little bit more about that?
Great comment and very good question. So within the electoral areas and the municipalities, it is a very different regulatory framework, and there are a couple of key drivers. One is the subdivisional approving agent, which is within the electoral areas, is the Ministry of Transportation and Highways. They're the agent which approves it. They deal with stormwater management at that level in terms of subdivisions. The liquid waste management plan also gives direction as a recommendation that local governments could include stormwater management within an integrated planning process under the liquid waste management plan, because it's really around the movement of contaminants across the landscape, and as the contaminants move, they pick up other elements upon the way. So it makes sense. However, from a regional district point of view and capacity is, we don't have a mechanism to undertake that effectively without additional support by the province, and we would be looking at that under the subdivision approving officer process.
Thank you very much. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your previous slide, point 4, talked about a bylaw for private septic systems to require them to meet best practice standards. Again, this goes to jurisdiction. I was always under the impression that Island Health regulated septic systems. How does that work here?
Absolutely. Island Health regulates septics under a best management approach, which goes to the installer. Within key components of our area, we, through the monitoring process, are starting to see septic effluent entering the receiving environment adjacent to water intakes. And so that would be a mechanism where the regulatory framework would be developed in partnership with other regulatory agencies.
So we have the authority to write that bylaw. That's what I'm trying to say.
We do. We have an authority to write the bylaw under the protection of the environment. And in particular, we've got areas across the region. I'm sure that directors around Lake Cowichan are familiar with this as well, where we have what you might call self-flushing septic systems, which may or may not be an issue if you've got a lot of turnover within the water column and a fairly large water body. However, when we start to see development where we've got properties immediately adjacent to each other with very limited capacity and the receiving environment under stress, where it's an issue for us. It is not our role to manage the quality of water from private intakes, nor is it the role to manage the proper maintenance of septic facilities. However, under a liquid waste management plan, you can have a regulatory framework in partnership with the other, similar to what we would look at with the Ministry of Agriculture.
Thank you.
Director Kuhn.
What are the funding options for all this?
That's a great question. It's a complicated question as well, because there's sort of two pieces to it. One is it's about the effective operation and management of infrastructure in which we own, so there's a relationship between the two. It's a positive relationship. Right now, or historically, funding for this master plan has come through gas tax, as well as a requisition for those particular areas. So it's been a partnership between the residents in terms of the requisition and gas tax dollars. So obviously, one of the challenges that we face is if we have very limited funding, then the process takes a lot longer, which means that it costs more because the percentage of overhead gets spread over multiple years, and so it's a challenge for us. We obviously, when we apply for funding, our funders don't really want to pay for a master plan. They want to pay for addressing some of the items that have been identified in the master plan. And that's one of the reasons why the Mill Bay and the Cobble Hill, and we are very hopeful that the grant application for Shawnigan will be successful, because we've got a problem statement, which is an important problem statement, and so how we address it. So it's a catch-22. Is it a liquid waste management plan in every other jurisdiction that I'm aware of that has a modern one? It's a constant investment in terms of monitoring, effectiveness, adjustments and updates and oversight. Is that a lot of money? It shouldn't be, but it's part of a regular O&M of a master plan, basically, the implementation component. So we can apply for grant funding. Do you want to do your master plans based on, the funding wheel? It's very challenging.
Director Acton?
Thank you. Maybe you could just clarify, I think this was a rumor I heard about this plan, was that it cost a lot of money and it was put on a shelf. And so is there maybe some truth in there that it's hard to integrate it how it is now, or where would that have come from?
I didn't hear the rumor directly, so I can't really speak to the rumor, but I can speak to the concept of that the master plan cost a lot of money and it sat on the shelf. I wasn't part of that master plan, so I don't know what the original cost was. I believe that it was paid for by grant funding. And we do have master plans that sit on the shelf. And one of the things that's really important for us to do is to look at those master plans and look at why they sit on the shelf. Is it as an organization that, and I would put forward that there hasn't been a body that pushes the master plan process, that the master plan, particularly in the South End, is very complicated. It includes multiple external agencies. It's not just a single agency like the central sector. So it really means partnerships. It means building capacity, et cetera. And if the prior group that had ownership over this was the CVRD Utilities Group, well, their primary function is to make sure that they are operating their utilities and providing their customers with the service that they're paying for, not to develop a master plan for the South area. And so that's another reason why it sits on a shelf, is we don't have a structure that really supports integration, and we're moving there. And that's one of the benefits of the board's strategic plan, which really said, let's look at ways at how we can integrate this effectively. And I think under the direction of Dr. Hatami, we're really trying to address that around effectiveness of the master plan process and being strategic in how we undertake them, and specifically in the recommendations around how we implement them. So I don't know if you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I want to add something, if I may.
Absolutely.
Normally, when you finish with a master plan, you come with a number of recommendations, and you put actually different categories: short-term, mid-term, long-term, and that term that you shelf a master plan and you forget about it is not correct, because sometimes the short-term immediate need we actually translate into a project or an activity that we do it in the next fiscal year. But the longer term, 5 years, 10 years, that's a long-term project. So we look into that. So it's not something that you do it and you just file it for forever. It becomes a kind of live document, and you would refer back to that. And the only time that normally we amend actually or update a master plan is when the regulation changes drastically, or the demand / population has increased a lot, so we have to go back and review that. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. Director Nicholson. Director Dory.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I signed on with the CVRD board 13 years ago, the master plan at that time seemed to be having one outfall to the ocean and collecting all of the all of the treatment facilities in the area and pumping it out. And then they had talk of forming a municipality. Oh, we'll let the municipality sort the details out because this is, we need to have the people on side and move forward with that. And then the directors sort of lost interest in forming municipalities, and so now we're at the stage we are right now. As far as I can see, this is a terrific plan. I've been waiting for it for a few years, and it's well thought out. It has steps, and it has all of the ingredients of something that we can really chew on. So I really congratulate you and Hamid on sorting this out and moving forward with these committees. I think it's a great thing, and it looks like you're heading more to 3 or 4 treatment systems rather than one big one, which is probably, I'm just predicting the future, but that's the way I look at it. And with regard to to septic systems. In Saltaire, we had an issue with coliform in the ditches a few years ago. And then when people knew the numbers of the ditches, then they started reporting, hey, this guy's septic system's not working right. And so they would continually upgrade anything that was leaking or causing a problem. And that led us to talking about a system that was in place in Nova Scotia, where they had actually in certain areas, they had a pumping regulation where every 4 or 5 years you had to have your septic system pumped and certified. And they even had trucks that would separate the solid waste from the liquid in the septic tank. So they'd pump it in and collect all the solids, and they'd move on to the next house so they could do 4 or 5 or 6 septic tanks in one fell swoop, which made it a lot cheaper. So that's something we could look at with, say, around Shawnigan Lake, where we've got a lot of leaching septic things, and in Saltaire, where it happens somewhat still, probably. So that's where we're going with this sort of thing. So I think you got a great plan, and I want to congratulate you on and all of this collected, and I think we'll get some really good input from the public, and because they can actually probably save money by what they're doing here, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Miller. And we'll move on now. That was for information. We're moving on to R5.
A report from the Public Safety Division regarding renewal of license of occupation at Bings Creek facility for the Cowichan Search and Rescue Society. And the recommendation is that it be recommended to the board that the Cowichan Search and Rescue Society be granted a license of occupation over bays 1 and 2 at Bings Creek facility effective October 1, 2018 to October 1, 2019.
Yeah, it was moved and seconded. Are there any questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Moving on now to any unfinished business.
No unfinished business?
New business.
No new business?
Question period. So question, any questions? Seeing none. Moving on now to, there is no closed session. Motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Lunch. I guess I should have said. Oh, 12:30 at. Oh, okay. In 213? Do you know where? Okay, yeah.
Changes if there's a meeting.
Yes, yeah.
Question period today?
There was.
Nobody stood up?
No.
No.
Yeah.